After a long and exhaustive module on trade compliance, we're now going to move into Module 4, the logistics of air exports. More tactical, more operational, but we'll be integrating with all of the topics that we've covered in the previous 3 modules. Let's see what we have. As far as our objectives go for Module 4, there are actually 4. The first one is to establish a multifaceted understanding of all the players and activities involved in a U.S. air export program. Who's out there? Who's part of the ecosystem? Who contributes to the overall value proposition of air export? Second bullet point, we want to emphasize the importance of integrating the activities of the shipper, the big player here, the air freight forwarder, airline, and appropriate U.S. government agencies in an export program. It's that ecosystem. How do they all come together to enhance the value proposition that we alluded to a moment ago? The value prop takes us all the way back to modules 1 and 2 in terms of how we as an exporter can use the tactical aspects of shipping to enhance our competitiveness in global markets. We'll see that here in air freight. We'll see it in Module 5 on ocean freight, and we'll certainly see it on Module 6 in NAFTA transportation. Of course, one of our biggest objectives overall is to enhance the student's knowledge of both the operational and service aspects of exporting by air from the U.S. Lots of operational nuances, tricks of the trade, ways of doing things. We're going to delve deeply into all of them. But as a note, it's important to mention that this module focuses on the operational aspects of air exports. Details on both transport and commercial documentation are covered in greater detail in Module 7, where we bring all of the documentation together. We'll certainly see docs in this module, but not to the extent that we'll see them in Module 7. Table of contents, let's run through that rather quickly. The first thing we're going to talk about is IATA, the International Air Transport Association, that non-government organization that really serves as the glue that brings the air cargo industry together. We'll talk about the U.S. air export market, little bit of a history lesson there, but rather fascinating actually. Then we'll get right into the operational aspect of things, dealing with the assets that move cargo. Cargo aircraft versus passenger aircraft. Then a good section on unit loading devices, or ULDs as they're called. And then a rather exhaustive conversation on the role of the air freight forwarder. What does the forwarder do? How does the forwarder offer services in such a way that it can enhance the value prop of the shipper? The air freight forwarder is there at the end of the day to not only provide air freight services, but to facilitate trade on behalf of the shipper and the buyer overseas as well. Within that discussion on air freight forwarders, we'll talk about indirect air carriers, and then the essence of how freight forwarders make money, really, at least in air freight, the air export cargo consolidation model. Pretty fascinating there as well. Should be of interest. We'll continue on with actual versus volume weight calculations and how airlines and freight forwarders make sure that they're optimizing their asset. The asset being the aircraft itself and its revenue earning potential. We'll touch a bit on air export transport docks, and then a whole area on perishables and temperature-controlled exports, sometimes referred to as cold chain. And then, in today's modern world, we can't talk about any mode of transport without getting into cargo security. In this case, air export cargo security and the role of the Transportation Security Administration here in the U.S. So with all that said, let's have a look at the International Air Transport Association. We will continue to refer to it as IATA. Well, actually, on the IATA website, they themselves promote themselves as a trade association. So IATA is the trade association that represents the world's airlines. Little bit of history for IATA. Oddly enough, probably never guessed this in a trivia question, but IATA was founded in Havana, Cuba in 1945, the same year that World War II ended, and nations of the world came together to form the United Nations, what became the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and in this instance, IATA. So there was a lot of work being done after the war to bring countries together in such a way to create some unity. So needless to say, travel, passenger travel, and to a certain extent cargo, really began to grow after World War II. So it was no coincidence that IATA was born right around that same time frame. IATA is headquartered in Montreal, Canada, and IATA has over 260 airline members from 117 different countries. As a mission statement, IATA is there to represent, lead, and serve the airline industry, and they really are the voice of the airline industry from a passenger as well as air cargo perspective, as we note in our second to the last bullet point. IATA, last bullet point, the organization is also very involved in integrating the forwarder airline relationship, the air freight forwarder, and how that forwarder works with the airlines. Not only domestically in the US, but more important for the purposes of our MES program, how they work together internationally. Let's have a look at some of the priorities and activities of IATA. First bullet point, as the representative of the world's airlines, IATA develops operational as well as accounting standards and tools in a number of areas. Sometimes people think IATA is there to provide standards just from an operating perspective, how the forwarders work with the airlines, cargo handling agents, things of that nature. But behind the scenes, one of the more important things IATA does is provide an accounting clearinghouse. And we'll talk about that in our first sub-bullet point. So IATA provides financial settlements for airlines, cargo agents, intermediaries, and air freight forwarders. And this is a global scheme within which IATA works. So different currencies, different business practices, certainly different languages, but how the airlines and forwarders and cargo agents, how they bill and pay one another behind the scenes, things that the shipper might not ever see, IATA provides that tool. Now, pre-internet, that was all done manually. Now, as we'll see in just a bit, everything is done electronically. IATA also provides standards for both passenger and cargo security. So if you've ever been on a plane, IATA is involved in the passenger side of things and definitely on the cargo security side of things. Ground operations at airports, transferring cargo from airports to bonded facilities as another example, working with local customs entities and such. IATA provides standards for all of those ground operations. Safety and aircraft tracking, regulatory considerations, both the regulations that IATA develops as well as country-specific regulations, how they get melded together, how everyone works together in a regulatory environment. And IATA does quite a bit of work in the area of environmental stewardship, trying to reduce the carbon footprint of the air cargo business and the passenger business too. But as a note, we should say this now, the MES program focuses exclusively on IATA's involvement with air cargo transportation. So we won't be talking about passengers anymore from this point forward. We're all about air freight. Check out the title of this slide, IATA's Cargo Value Proposition. This should take us back down memory lane when we talk so much about the shipper's value proposition, the U.S. exporter's value proposition, and how to construct a business model in such a way that it keeps customers coming back repeatedly. Well, IATA has a value proposition too. And as a part of its cargo-specific value prop, IATA works in 5 strategic areas. First one we mentioned, for a sub-bullet point, global standards and tools that all members of the air cargo ecosystem can use. Those financial services that we alluded to, as well as industry-specific solutions, transformation projects and industry mobilization. IATA really works hard in these areas, pushing the industry forward, bringing everybody into the 21st century with some projects that we'll talk about later on. But a real leader in terms of the air cargo industry. IATA works on partnerships and industry collaboration, bringing the ecosystem together. The airlines, the ground handlers, the agents, the air freight forwarders, government entities, bringing those parties together. And when they do that, engaging in advocacy and outreach, being out in the community, especially communities around airports that have so much activity from both a passenger and a cargo perspective. So within the above framework, it should be clear that IATA serves as the primary link between the airlines and the air freight forwarding community. Call it the glue that holds the air cargo supply chain mosaic together. Pretty good metaphor to describe IATA. In terms of the organization's cargo-related activities, let's have a look at what they do. Well, with regards to cargo, IATA provides standards, talked about that, training, we haven't mentioned that yet, and services in the following areas. Operations, as we see from our image here, the actual handling of cargo, documentation, and information. Accreditation, something we'll discuss in a moment, but how individuals and companies can become accredited as IATA agents or a DG or achieve a DG Dangerous Goods certification. IATA offers a lot of accreditation programs. We'll see what they are in just a moment. Those accounting and financial services, a clearinghouse, if you will, now a B2B, business to business clearinghouse, a platform, to use the terminology in the internet age, for all the parties to work together from a financial perspective. Billing, acknowledging invoices, payments, settlements, etc. IATA does a lot of great work with its publications and regulations. Dangerous goods regs, the air cargo tariff, a bunch of different regs actually. We'll see what they are. And then industry training. We have to say, in the spirit of objectivity, that IATA does a very nice job of providing training programs on a number of different subjects. So kudos to them for that. IATA's operational focus. First bullet point, IATA works hard to develop operational standards and regulations in a number of areas. Some of the bigger ones are DG, Dangerous Goods as they're called. For a sub-bullet point, IATA works with local governments and the International Civil Aviation Organization, the ICAO, in the development of dangerous goods regulations. In terms of keeping people safe, both in the air and on the ground, honestly, this is probably the most important work that IATA does. They put together all of the standards for handling dangerous goods, labeling, packaging, handling, all of those things. And as such, the IATA Dangerous Goods Regulations, the DGR, is the only standard recognized by the airlines. Really, really critical. As a note, we have to state that detailed training on dangerous goods, it's outside the scope of the MES. So we won't be going into DG in the MES program. Some other things that IATA does from an operational perspective, the IATA Live Animals Regulations. You can't just fly live animals around. There are certain regs out there to protect the animals themselves and the people that handle them too. So IATA has their LAR, the Live Animals Regulations. Some more points from an operational perspective. IATA has done a considerable amount of work in the area of pharmaceutical and healthcare products. They developed the IATA Temperature Control Regulations, some more regs, the TCR, and as we see on the right here, an example of time and temperature sensitive labels for pharmaceutical shipments. There are also standards for the handling of perishables, foodstuff perishables, and also, something we mentioned very briefly, Unit Loading Device Safety Program. ULDs are assets. They're pallets. They're air freight containers. They have to be maintained. They have to be kept safe to keep aircraft and people safe themselves. So IATA has done the whole Unit Loading Device Safety Program. A couple of more things on the operational side. Cargo security. In the age of terror, needless to say, essential to global trade. And IATA has stepped forward by developing standardized formats such as the Consignment Security Declaration, we'll see that a little bit later, and Advanced Cargo Information. As the name would indicate, electronically sharing information about cargo long before a flight takes off. Quick trade tip here, because IATA's efforts are on a global scale. IATA's security work is consistent with the standards provided by the World Customs Organization and their safe framework of standards to secure and facilitate global trade. You might recognize the WCO, as it's called, the World Customs Organization, as the entity that also publishes the harmonized system. We'll see more on that when we talk about AES filings, but for now, in this context, we'll say that IATA is consistent with the WCO's safe framework of standards to secure and facilitate global trade. Trying to bring everybody together and singing off the same sheet of music. Last slide in this opening section, some other operational standards, E-Freight. And based on the name, you should be able to guess what this topic is about. The air cargo industry, from its earliest inception, was all about physical paper, lots and lots of paper. For some time now, Going back, goodness, 15, 20 years now, IATA has engaged in an industry-wide initiative to remove paper from the air cargo industry that involves carriers, forwarders, ground handlers, shippers, customs brokers, and customs authorities. More and more players in the air freight ecosystem sharing information, sharing documentation electronically. Airway bills, confirmed on board notifications, arrival notification, things like that. We'll talk more about the details in forthcoming slides. But as part of eFreight, EAWB, an electronic airway bill, this is the greatest focus that IATA has, is on the electronic transmission of airway bills and related information amongst air cargo partners, bringing everybody together in a B2B platform, trying to eliminate paperwork. Lots of work going on behind the scenes there. So that's the end of this section. When we pick up, we're going to talk about IATA's quality program called Cargo IQ. We'll be back shortly.